At 86 years old, Jane Fonda has lived more than one lifetime. She's been a silver screen darling, a political fire starter, a cultural icon, and for many women, a voice when they felt unheard. But not long ago, Jane did something she rarely does. She paused. In a quiet moment inside her Los Angeles home, sitting in a sunlit room filled with books, old photos, and decades of memories, she looked away from the camera and said something that left everyone silent. "I don't think I have much time left," she whispered. "But before I go, I want to make this clear." There was no spotlight, no applause, just her voice. Calm, steady, and filled with a weight that only comes from a life fully lived. She wasn't promoting a film. She wasn't attending an award show. She wasn't performing. She was remembering. Reflecting. Unloading something she had carried for far too long. And what she said next wasn't about her legendary career. It wasn't about beauty, glamour, or the dozens of characters she brought to life. It wasn't even about politics, which she has so fiercely defended all her life. It was about truth. The kind of truth that only shows up in the final chapters of our lives. The kind you can't fake, or polish, or rehearse. The kind that comes when there's nothing left to prove. Only something left to say. You see, this isn't just another Hollywood story. It's a human one. It's about legacy. It's about regret. It's about what we leave behind when the lights go out and the camera stops rolling. And it's about a woman who, after decades of being admired, misunderstood, loved, hated, celebrated, and criticized, finally decided to speak not as a symbol, but as herself. For those who've ever felt unseen, for those who've ever looked back and wondered what it was all for, this story, Jane's story, is for you. Because behind the awards and headlines, behind the magazine covers and the protests, is a woman who carries everything she's ever been, and is just now starting to let it go. So before we talk about what she said, we need to understand what she lived through. Let's go back, not to the beginning of her fame, but to the heart of who she really is. There was a time when Jane Fonda didn't need an introduction. By the late 1960s, she had already become a household name, not just in America, but around the world. She wasn't just an actress. She was the moment. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was her depth, her conviction, and her courage that made her unforgettable. Born into the spotlight as the daughter of Henry Fonda, one of Hollywood's most respected actors, Jane could have easily coasted on her last name. But she never did. She didn't want to live in someone else's shadow. She wanted to make her own. And she did. With films like Klute, 1971, where she played a call girl caught in a murder investigation, Jane showed critics that she wasn't just a pretty face, she was a force. That role won her an Academy Award. Then came Coming Home, 1978, a powerful story about a Vietnam veteran and a woman discovering the cost of war. That earned her a second Oscar. But even then, Jane insisted she wasn't acting for trophies. "I never acted for the applause," she once said in an interview with Vanity Fair. "I acted because I needed to say something." And that's what separated her from so many others. While others were chasing fame, Jane was chasing truth. She chose roles that challenged the system, that told the stories people were afraid to hear. And off-screen, she was even more fearless. When the world expected women, especially actresses, to smile and stay quiet, Jane was marching, speaking, shouting. She became a vocal opponent of the Vietnam War, even traveling to Hanoi in 1972, a move that sparked outrage but also opened conversations few dared to have. In 1982, just when critics thought they had her figured out, Jane reinvented herself again. She launched the Jane Fonda Workout, a VHS fitness tape that would go on to sell over 17 million copies. It wasn't just about aerobics. It was about empowerment. Women across the country, many of them stay-at-home moms or middle-aged professionals, found strength, confidence, and solidarity in those tapes. Few knew at the time that Jane used the proceeds to fund left-wing political causes, including advocacy for Native American rights, women's health, and environmental issues. She turned fitness into activism, and once again, challenged what a woman could be. She was elegance and rebellion wrapped into one. Glamour without apology, power without permission. Jane could walk a red carpet in a designer gown, and then, the very next day, be arrested during a climate change protest in Washington, D.C. And people followed her, especially women, millions of them. Because Jane wasn't just another celebrity. She was someone who seemed to live with her whole heart exposed. Someone who dared to take up space in a world that often tried to shrink women down. But even someone as fearless, as radiant, as seemingly invincible as Jane Fonda couldn't outrun what was coming. Because when the applause begins to fade, when the spotlight starts to dim, what remains is not the fame, it's the person. And Jane was about to face the person behind the icon. For a long time, Jane Fonda was the woman who seemed to have it all together. She was famous, powerful, admired by millions, and yet, behind all the red carpets and flashing lights, there were parts of her story she didn't let the world see. Not because she was hiding, but because she hadn't yet found the strength to face them herself. She was well into her 60s when she finally opened up about something deeply personal, something painful. In a quiet conversation, she shared that she had been sexually abused as a child, and for years, she didn't even have the words to describe what had happened to her. Like so many women of her generation, she learned to stay quiet, to push it down, to move on. But that silence carried weight. It shaped her. And it followed her, even into the spotlight. Jane also began speaking more openly about her lifelong struggle with depression. She described feeling hollow at times, even during what looked like the peak of her success. 2 Academy Awards, best-selling workout tapes, her face on every magazine stand, and still, something was missing. She once said, "I was always trying to be who I thought other people wanted me to be. But deep down, I didn't really know myself." That kind of honesty hit home for a lot of people. Because it's not just her story. It's the story of so many of us. Trying to be enough. Trying to be perfect. Until one day, you stop and ask, who am I really doing all this for? That moment of awakening changed Jane. It didn't happen all at once. But little by little, she started shedding the layers. She began choosing causes over camera time. She stepped away from scripts and leaned into purpose. In her 70s and 80s, she became one of the most active voices in the fight against climate change. She stood on the front lines of protests, got arrested in Washington, D.C., and inspired a whole new generation of activists, not as a movie star, but as a woman who refused to sit down when it mattered most. She also became a powerful advocate for women's health and aging, especially for those who felt invisible once they passed a certain age. She talked openly about menopause, about body image, about what it means to grow older in a culture obsessed with staying young. And she did it with a grace that made people listen. She started mentoring younger women. She showed up for causes that didn't make headlines. She sat on panels not to talk about her movies, but to talk about healing, about truth, about how long it takes to finally come home to yourself. And through it all, you could sense a different energy in Jane. Less urgency, more peace, less performance, more presence. She wasn't trying to impress anyone anymore. She was simply being herself, for the first time in her life, fully and completely. And maybe that's what made this version of Jane Fonda the most powerful of all. Not the actress, not the activist, just the woman. The one who had known pain, learned from it, and now stood tall enough to say, "This is who I am. No more pretending." Jane Fonda has lived a life that most people only dream of. She's walked red carpets in Paris, spoken on the Senate floor in Washington, and stood in front of millions with a confidence that felt larger than life. But when the lights faded and the applause quieted, what was left wasn't a legend. It was a woman. A woman with regrets, with pain, with stories she had kept tucked away. Until now. For decades, Jane was the image of power and poise. But behind that image was something far more complicated. In private interviews and deeply personal reflections shared later in life, she admitted that for most of her years in the public eye, she was playing a part. Not the kind she trained for in films, but a role she crafted for survival. She said, "I spent so long pretending to be someone I wasn't. I didn't even realize I was performing. It just became my way of being." This performance wasn't about lines or cameras. It was about molding herself into whatever the moment needed her to be. A perfect wife, a powerful activist, a glamorous star. And when those moments passed, she often felt empty, like a hollow version of the person she was supposed to be. One of the most revealing chapters of her personal story begins with her relationship with Ted Turner. To the outside world, they were a power couple. He was the billionaire founder of CNN. She was the internationally adored icon. But inside their marriage, things were unraveling. Jane later shared that while she loved Ted deeply, she began to realize that she had disappeared inside the relationship. She lost her voice trying to keep the peace. She compromised more than she should have. And when the marriage ended in divorce after 10 years, Jane found herself alone at 70, sitting in a house that no longer felt like home. That loneliness wasn't just about being without a partner. It was the kind of loneliness that comes when you realize you've spent your life moving, achieving, talking, but rarely listening to your own heart. At 70 years old, Jane Fonda began a journey that had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with truth. She once said in an interview, "I didn't know who I was until I turned 60. Think about that. A woman who had been on magazine covers since her 20s, who had influenced generations of women, who had testified before Congress, saying she didn't truly know herself until she was 60. That sentence stayed with people, because many of us feel it too. We live for others, we lose ourselves in roles, responsibilities, and relationships, and one day, we look in the mirror and wonder, where did I go? But perhaps one of the most tender parts of Jane's story is her relationship with her children. She has spoken openly about how she wasn't always the mother she wanted to be. Fame took her away. Activism took her energy. Perfectionism took her presence. And her children felt it. Jane admitted that there were years when the connection was strained, moments she couldn't get back, words she wished she had said, apologies she held inside too long. She once recalled a memory that broke her heart. Her daughter said, "You were never really there, Mom." That sentence cut deep. Because it wasn't about absence in the physical sense. It was emotional absence. The kind that happens when you're so caught up in surviving or succeeding that you forget how to simply sit and listen. Jane didn't run from that truth. She leaned into it. In her later years, she started writing letters to her children, not because she had all the answers, but because she finally had the courage to face the questions. She began rebuilding those bridges slowly, one conversation at a time, one vulnerable moment at a time, and in doing so, she didn't just heal them. She healed a part of herself that had long been closed off. That's what makes her story so deeply human. Because for all the fame, for all the causes, for all the success, Jane Fonda had to walk through the same dark places many of us do. Heartbreak, identity loss, regret. And she chose to tell the truth about it. Not just to make peace with the past, but to help others find the courage to tell their own truths too. She once said, "Healing isn't about fixing. It's about finding the parts of you that you left behind and gently bringing them home." That's the kind of wisdom that doesn't come from textbooks or film scripts. It comes from being broken open by life and deciding not to close back up again. Even her work as an activist shifted with age. While she remained passionate about climate change and social justice, she started talking more about internal landscapes, about emotional resilience, about aging with grace, about forgiving yourself for who you weren't able to be. In workshops, panels, and interviews, she showed up as someone who had nothing left to prove, and that's what made her magnetic all over again. Because there's something powerful about a woman who has lived through fire and come out softer, not harder. Someone who doesn't pretend anymore. Someone who can stand in a room, say, "I got it wrong," and still stand tall. She also spoke directly to older women, those who often feel invisible in a youth-driven culture. She reminded them that they still matter, that their stories aren't over, that aging isn't the end of relevance, it's the beginning of something deeper, more rooted, more honest. In one speech, she looked out at a crowd of women over 60 and said, "We've been told our time has passed. But what if our time is just beginning?" The room fell silent, not out of sadness, but out of recognition, because someone had finally said what so many had felt in silence. This new version of Jane, more grounded, more open, more raw, touched people in ways her younger self never could. She wasn't trying to be perfect anymore. She was trying to be real. And in a world that's full of filters, perfection, and posturing, that kind of honesty feels like a revolution. Her story reminds us that life doesn't begin or end at any particular age. It begins when you finally decide to stop performing and start showing up. It begins when you trade control for connection. When you trade proving for presence. When you stop running from yourself and finally sit with everything you've been through. Jane Fonda didn't just teach us how to fight. She taught us how to feel. How to face the past without fear. How to turn regret into responsibility. And how to tell the truth, even when it hurts. As we move toward the next part of her story, her final message to the world, we do so with a new understanding. Jane Fonda wasn't a perfect woman. She was a brave one. And sometimes, that's even more powerful. In the spring of 2023, Jane Fonda gave an interview that didn't make flashy headlines. It didn't come with glamorous photos or dramatic music. But what she said in that moment landed deeper than anything she'd ever said on a movie screen. She leaned forward, soft-spoken and steady, and said, "I don't know how much longer I'll be around, but I want young women to know, never live for the applause. Live for your soul." She didn't say it for attention. She didn't say it to be profound. She said it because it was the truth she had carried quietly for decades. And once those words were out in the world, they hit like a wave. Quiet but impossible to ignore. In that single sentence, Jane spoke to something most of us have felt, but never quite knew how to say. The pressure to please. The weight of being what others need us to be. The exhaustion of living a life measured by other people's approval instead of our own peace. And just like that, her message started to spread. People across the country shared her words online. Hashtags like #ThankYouJane showed up on Instagram, Twitter, even Facebook. But it wasn't just admiration. They were stories. Real women writing about the masks they'd worn, the dreams they'd shelved, the parts of themselves they'd ignored just to keep the peace. And while the internet was lighting up, Jane wasn't chasing the attention. She wasn't doing interviews or riding the momentum. She was home, sitting in a quiet room by the window, journaling. Not for the public, not for the cameras, just for herself. She was writing reflections, letters she may never send, thoughts she may never publish. A friend later said in a podcast that Jane was working through the final chapters of her life, the same way she lived the best ones, with intention, with grace, and above all, with honesty. And that image, that quiet scene of her by the window, hair loose, pen in hand, no makeup, no script, is the one that stays with me. Because it wasn't about Hollywood anymore. It wasn't about politics or legacy. It was about presence. A woman who has lived through applause, through protest, through pain, and come to the other side with something softer, something more real. That's what makes her words matter so much. She didn't just say them, she lived them. Her message wasn't a goodbye, it was a reminder. A reminder that what really lasts in this life isn't what we achieve, it's what we awaken in others. She reminded us that being seen is one thing, but being known, being true to yourself, even when it's messy, even when it's quiet, that's something else entirely. That's freedom. When we look at the life of Jane Fonda, it's easy to see the headlines, movie star, activist, icon. But if you really sit with her story, if you listen past the noise, what you hear is something far deeper. You hear a woman who fought like hell to be seen, then chose to spend her final years seeing others. She was bold, yes, loud even. But when the cameras turned off, Jane Fonda became something even more powerful. She became still, and in that stillness, she found a different kind of voice. One that didn't need microphones. One that didn't need to fill a room. Just one that needed to tell the truth. From being the face of rebellion in the 70s to becoming a gentle guide in her 80s, Jane's life reminds us that reinvention doesn't have an expiration date. She proved that you can be fierce and forgiving, broken and brave all at once. She showed us that aging isn't about fading, it's about arriving. Arriving at yourself. Arriving at a place where you don't have to prove anything anymore. Where you don't chase applause, you chase peace. And she gave us a gift. A sentence that echoed in quiet hearts everywhere. Never live for the applause. Live for your soul. That wasn't just advice, that was a map. For the woman watching this who has spent her life giving everything to others. For the man who never felt heard growing up. For the soul who's been performing for far too long. Jane's story offers something rare. Permission. Permission to put the show down. To stop clapping for things you don't believe in. To finally, deeply, be who you were always meant to be. And maybe that's why this video matters. Not because it's about a star, but because it's about a truth we've all needed to hear. So if her story touched you, don't just click away. Let her voice keep echoing. Share this with someone who needs it. Let it remind them. And maybe remind you that the most important applause is the one you give yourself, when no one else is watching. Because in the end, Jane Fonda didn't just leave behind films or protests. She left behind clarity. And in a world that's louder than ever, clarity is a quiet revolution.